European countries have been going through a pretty deep recession over the last few years. So despite low interest rates, we still have a lot of non-performing loans. Low interest rates have helped avoiding defaults, but the level of non-performing loans in the European Union across banks is still very high compared to other jurisdictions. According to the EBA, the level is about 5.7%. Just to give you from a comparison point of view, it's 1.5% in the United States. It's obviously very skewed across countries, and in some jurisdictions it has been easier to reduce them. So if you look at, for example, France, it's about, I think, 4%. Then if you look at Italy, it's 18%. If you look at Spain, it's about 6%. So but there is obviously an issue. So we have a very large amount of NPLs in Europe, and for some reason, which is something that hasn't happened elsewhere, we cannot get rid of them. So one of the reasons that we have identified, obviously today during the conference, has been the insolvency law, right? During the panel, we're probably going to discuss also other things that are preventing. So I will ask with one very general question to all of you. What do you think is the primary, and I'll ask you to give basically one answer. What do you think is the primary reason, if there is any, preventing a functional NPL market in Europe? So just answer with one single, what's basically topping your agenda in a way.
Thank you, Mario. First of all, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank Sophie and the organization for kindly inviting me. As you can see, I'm not in the slide. I'm not in the original organization, but I have the fortune and I'm working in the NPLs on the regulatory side, so I will start with a caveat. I'm not an expert in insolvency, but I'm expert in regulation and supervision. So basically, how to regulate, how to supervise non-performing loans, at least how to identify the quality of loan, how to identify the quality of asset. Currently, there is no common financial language, there is no common standard to define non-performing loans. Are they doubtful loans, bad loans, past due loans, or just non-performing loans? So, first of all, we need to identify a common language, a common standard, and a common regulatory framework. So the same loan that possibly can be regulated in the same way, not only at the EU level, but also outside the EU.
Just to add a quote on what Andrea said, the problem that we have with non-performing loans, before I give you my one-liner, is that basically you can have cases like, Andrea, correct me if I'm mistaken, but from the research we've been conducting in Russia, after 30 days, it will be non-performing. And then you have, for example, in China, after 120 days. So this already generates an additional issue as to how do we classify non-performing, and then what exactly is not performing, because you have different accounting definitions and different subcategories of, let's say, the genus, which is non-performing. But going to your original question as to what is the single, in one liner, what is the reason why, I would say the lack of an efficient pre-insolvency regime to deal with non-performing loans.
Okay, thank you very much. I will look at the issue from the perspective of the Italian situation that, as you know, is probably one of the most interesting, I could say. From the point of view of the Italian situation, I would say that the main obstacles to the main factor that is hindering the disposal of non-performing loans in Italy is the length of the procedure. The recovery time in Italy is really long. This has an obvious effect if you are looking at the balance sheet of banks. The longer it takes to dispose of a NPL, the longer it stays in the balance sheet. But the length of the recovery has also an impact on the possibility of developing a market for non-performing loans. Why is that? We all know that the evaluation of the distressed asset is based on the recovery time has a huge impact on the evaluation of distressed asset. And we all know also that there are differences in the criteria used by financial institutions to evaluate these assets in their balance sheet, and the criteria used by investors to evaluate those assets. And particularly in the interest rates, which is used to discount the value of the cash flow associated to these assets. Simulation we have carried out at the Bank of Italy show very clearly that these differences are amplified by the length of the recovery time. This means that for a given difference in the interest rate used to discount the value of the asset, the longer the time needed to recover them, the bigger will be the gap between the price asked and the price offered. So in this respect, we believe this is a crucial issue to be solved in order to favor both the direct outflows of NPLs from the balance sheet of the bank, and above all, to develop the market for non-performing loans.
Silvia, isn't that the lack of an efficient pre-insolvency mechanism to deal with them? Because your main complaints are timing. One of your main complaints is deficiency. So that's how I see it, and I fully agree with what you're saying.
Shall I give the you want me to answer directly?
Yes.
Yeah, I think there are, of course, there are two different factors which both have an impact. If you lack of efficient pre-insolvency or restructuring tools to deal with non-performing loans, of course, this is has an impact. But nevertheless, I think that just looking at the numbers, the number of firms which are liquidated are so big, at least in Italy, but I think this is the case also in other European countries where the rescue culture we have heard this morning by Justin Dower is not so developed. In Italy, we have introduced restructuring tools since 2005. We have a wide range of them, going from out-of-court restructuring tools to judicial procedure for restructuring. And but since the introduction of these tools, it takes long for them to be really effective. So we are in a kind of transition phase, and I think this is the case of Italy, but not only of Italy. So I think it's a common feature of other European countries. Meanwhile, we are in this transition phase where we want to put more emphasis on restructuring tools. We need, in any way, very efficient liquidation procedures.
Alain.
Thank you, Silvia. Two things. I will really echo the comment made by Silvia, and I think, it's a general theme that anything that can, so to say, quicken and optimize the collection process is going to be a big positive to improve the situation. However, I wouldn't, characterize the NPL market as non-existent or non-functioning. What's clear is that we are way behind the US situation, and B, there are marked differences between European market, in particular UK and Ireland, and the rest of continental Europe. As you may know, at Cerberus, I think we are the clear leader when it comes to buying NPL portfolio, having achieved in excess of 30 billion euros of transaction over the last couple of years. So this is an existing market. This is a functioning market from a financial perspective. We certainly do believe that it can grow much further, and we will certainly agree that most of the key obstacle for further growth of this market, which will be in the best interest of the European financial system, are legal rather than financial ones.
Okay, thank you. So it kind of boils down to the question of, I guess, of the panel, which is the having some sort of an insolvency law in either in each country or kind of universal that can help, solve or overcome this obstacle, either if it's pre-insolvency or if it's during the liquidation procedure or in between, or if it's even like the definition of the loan itself. So in terms of the features, right, let's run a sort of theoretical experiment and imagine that we had, because today we have been talking a lot about convergence of insolvency laws or changing the laws of the countries where we are, etc. So let's imagine that we had a clean white sheet that we could just create an insolvency law from scratch. What would be, for example, starting from you, Silvia, what would be the features that from your point of view, the main features that you would highlight that would really make it effective and, at least for the purpose of having a more efficient NPL market? And let's imagine by absurd that we didn't have any, labor laws or other things that could, prevent, etc., etc.
I think this is requires too much imagination, probably, because of the complementarity that exists between the insolvency laws, the insolvency regimes, and other institutional features of jurisdiction. I think this is a very difficult question. If we take this with the perspective of the economist, of an economist, what we can say is that there is a strong consensus of what are what should be the objectives of an insolvency law. The insolvency law should ensure the rescue of distressed but viable firms and the prompt liquidation of non-viable ones. It should provide incentives to maximize the value for all the actors involved, debtors, creditors, but also other stakeholders. This morning we have been heard about how relevant is for the French insolvency framework to the objective of saving jobs. But also the insolvency framework has to be designed in a way that balance in a way that does not discourage the risk-taking of the future risk-taking of firms and investors. So if we all can easily agree on these objectives, and I think also what we have seen this morning with the presentation by the EC Commission, it's much more difficult to going from these objectives to the actual design of an insolvency framework. So in this respect, I think that the approach which is the EC Commission is following is the right one. They are identifying very basic, I would say, principles that will translate into tools, and I think this approach is the correct one compared to the other one, which could be to specify detailed provision. And why is that? I think it is very, very difficult to have an insolvency framework which is one size that fits for all. Both because of the institutional complementarities I was mentioning, but also I think because of the fact that in insolvency framework has to deal with in most economies with the specificity of that economy. For instance, if you are like most European countries, you have an economy characterized by the presence of a large share of very small firms. Maybe you want to design an insolvency framework which has tools which are specially designed to tackle the distress of small and medium enterprises, which might be quite different from what you need when you are dealing with very large corporations. Another example could be the ownership structure of the firm. We have been this morning listening to a very interesting discussion about the role of shareholders, but I believe that what we've been heard is something which really applies very well in a situation where you have dispersed ownership. When you have very concentrated ownership, the shareholder is much more entrenched, and so it's much more difficult. The old house problem are really more pervasive in that situation. So to conclude, I think that the objectives are relatively easily to identify. The precise tools to deal with specific, to reach this objective are much more difficult to design.
And do you think, and that's for all of you, do you think that the creating one insolvency law for basically every single country can be easier than, to facilitate the resolution of NPLs than actually keeping the current laws and perhaps, as you were saying, sort of amend and learn from experience?
Mario, let me go one step before. I think that basically the guiding principle should be celerity, certainty, predictability, and economic efficiency. And the other thing is also drawing from past experience on specific country missions providing technical assistance in insolvency laws. One of the things that we need to bear in mind is that we are facing the problem now. And we can discuss about some grandiose projects of amending insolvency laws, and also we can discuss about a universal insolvency law. But by the time that we would achieve any of these two, even if it's a single reform in a given jurisdiction, this can take a long time. And it's not only the long time that will take, because you need to buy, basically different stakeholders need to buy into the project. The other thing that you need to also consider is that basically we can have a state-of-the-art insolvency law, and you still need to make sure that you have trained stakeholders that know how to apply and what are the benefits, and you need to deal with issues such as uncertainty on what will be the outcomes. That's one of the aspects. The other aspect that I would like to highlight is, and again, without a proper definition as to what is NPLs and all the different subcategories, etc., with different variants according to each jurisdiction, this lack of common regime makes things difficult. But irrespective of if we manage to overcome this difficulty, we still need to face another issue, which is the negative stigma that a formal insolvency regime will affect, and how this will affect the company doing the restructuring. So that's why basically, if you ask me, and on top of that, let's remember that basically those that have the NPLs are banks. And basically there's a higher degree of volatility. So basically, with all these elements, I personally think that the way forward should be some kind of ad hoc, soft law, some code of principles, some kind of general guidelines that can be put in place to deal with the situation. Why? An insolvency law reform will take a long time, plus stakeholders need to buy in the project, and after the project, in applying the new regime with the uncertainty that they will bring. And on top of that, I think that what you need to prioritize is celerity, not only in creating the rules of the game, but because basically we have rules of the game, but basically what we need to do is we need to come up with some kind of a pragmatic patch that will allow you to do the restructurings quickly, and I think that basically some principle-based set of guidelines, soft code, we can discuss about different forms that have been used in the past in different jurisdictions, etc. But I think that basically, I personally don't think that the way forward is with a full-blown insolvency law reform.
Following Rodrigo's discussion, I can say from the regulatory and supervisory perspective that at EU level, EBA in 2013 published a set of guidelines, a set of recommendations, set of standards as a soft law rule to regulate non-performing loans. So I agree with Rodrigo that before to talk about the insolvency law, before to talk about the pre-insolvency regime, we need to set up the definition, the classification of non-performing loans, and to decide case by case, ad hoc, what non-performing loans can affect. For example, in globally systemically important banks, the 30 globally systemically important banks, for non-global systemically important banks, for simple commercial banks. So it's very difficult at the moment to talk about an insolvency regime. Why? Because there is a lack of regulatory framework. There is a soft law regime at EU level, EBA level, also at ECB, and the European Parliament in September published another document with guidelines, recommendations, so soft law rules. So basically, we need to identify, we need to classify, we need to understand what non-performing loans are.
And I think that there are two sides of the same coin. I think that basically, on the one side, it's one which is much more technical, that has to do with how to reconcile the different positions and basically what will fall within the restructuring. And the other one will be what will be the actual regime to conduct a restructuring.
Yeah.
So basically, they are interconnected, but I think that there are two different problems, and there are two different problems that can be kind of, let's say, a solution or approach to deal with them can be triggered simultaneously, because basically you don't need to have one to develop the other one. But I agree with you that basically, but at the end of the day, the first one, the technical, the classification, it's an issue that delays the execution. But that's another one. But I see that as being one that can be dealt on a one-by-one basis. Eventually, no? I mean, and again, this is another third discussion, which is whether we should go domestically or pan-European or global. But that would be, again, a third discussion.
And Alain, from your point of view as an investor, what kind of difficulties have you encountered, and in dealing with the non-performing loans, to buy and to service them, and also what do you think an alternative investor would need in terms of tools and to enter the NPL market? And
I think there are two separate issues. We at Cerberus have an industrial model, i.e. we buy NPL on the market, and as I was mentioning before, we are clear leader on that market. But we also have the ability to service loans. For instance, MCS Group, the company I'm involved with in France, is actually the leading independent servicing provider in France. Independent meaning not a subsidiary of any existing bank, and we have the privilege to work with almost all of the French banking institutions. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, because it means that we have the ability to manage the risk profile of a loan, both from an IT perspective, but also from a legal perspective, up to collection. So this is a very different model, and it's not a criticism, it's a fact. It's a very different model from a purely capital market approach, where you would just buy, and at some point, sell portfolio of NPL on the market. And for us, it's clear that the future will be that industrial approach. Service, the ability to service loans is key for us, number one. Number two, when I look at the financial market, let's not forget that the financial conditions have been extremely conducive to those kind of transactions over the last couple of years. We've enjoyed, thanks to the central bank's policy, access to liquidity, and it's clear that under those key conditions, which are not legal conditions, but which are at least as important, we couldn't see a development of the market we are facing. If you ask me, Mario, what are the difficulties for an alternative investors to enter the market, I wouldn't say there are that many difficulties, because we did. So it's certainly possible. We are not the only one. I don't really know what an alternative investor means, so I'm not going to go into that, but I will say that clearly we come from a situation where NBL, by definition, are generated and up to their mass majority on the books of banking institutions. The financial conditions are there to create liquidity by having what I will call, financial investors, whether they choose to be purely financial investors or whether they choose to adopt an industrial model through having these abilities, enter that market.
May I say something on this? It's very, very good for our point of view to hear that there are all these investors coming to buy MPS. But maybe, okay. No, the thing is, in Italy, this is a big issue. If you are looking at the factors which are behind the figures you mentioned, there are three main factors which has allowed this huge increase in the stock of non-performing loans. One is the recession. Italy has been hit by a double recession in few years. Just to give you a figure to let you gauge what the entity, what we are facing. In Italy, during the Great Recession, we lost something like 25% of the industrial production capacity, which is really huge. It means firms, it means distressed loans. So this is one factor. The other factor is the factor I mentioned before, the length of the recovery procedure. And the other factor which is behind this huge stock is that the market for non-performing loans is underdeveloped, at least in Italy. And so it's a priority for Italy to create the condition to restart this market. From the perspective of investors, this is what has been told by investors to Italian authorities. One big issue that is preventing the development of the market is the lack of information, lack of transparency in the market. So to tackle this issue, I mean, the Italian authorities have been taking initiatives both at legislative level and at the supervisory level. And I'll take this opportunity to mention one thing which I think it's a very important measure in this respect, which is the creation of the National Registry of Insolvencies and Enforcement Proceedings. This has been provided for by a law which has been approved in last summer, and we are setting up this registry, which will be managed by the Ministry of Justice, and the Bank of Italy will have access to it for supervisory purposes. It will have a public section where all the information on all the proceedings, all the restructuring proceedings, both out of court and judicial ones, are recorded, and also the enforcement proceedings are recorded. There will be access not only to the basic information such as the name of the debtor, the status of the proceedings, the type, and the court, things like that, but also access to the documents which are behind the proceedings. It's going to be a big change in the market, we believe. I think it's an important tool for banks because they will allow them to better monitoring the evolution of the proceedings, to better management them, but also we believe this is a very important tool for investors. I would say in two respects. One, it will provide information on potential targets for turnaround operations, for restructuring operations. It will greatly reduce the cost of the time and the cost of the due diligence activities on the, for investors who are buying large portfolio of non-performing loans, because they we might have direct access to the information. Another thing which I believe will be useful for the development of the market is that based on the information contained in the registry, the investor might be able to have precise information on the recovery times for the different type of proceedings, and also for the taking into account the wide heterogeneity that there is in the function of Italian courts. So this will allow a better evaluation of the distressed loan and a better pricing.
If I may ask or make a comment on your current statement, let me make clear as a general statement, I am always in favor of transparency, but we are dealing with loans sitting in the portfolios of banks, and transparency who will be accessed by whom, in the sense that basically the sophisticated investors who are interested in the non-performing loans have either, I would say they will have direct access to the banking institutions who hold these non-performing loans. And making this information public, I fear that this might trigger some of the things that we are experiencing nowadays with some of the Italian banks, where basically this might generate some reaction to being confronted with the real numbers. And basically, of course, I will always be in favor of transparency, and I think that basically transparency is essential. But basically, remember that, in my view, we are dealing with a special kind of creature here, which basically the one on which all the NPLs are sitting. And on top of that, I think, and probably Alain might be in a better position to tell us, but I think that basically those potential investors have a direct line of communication with the banks to access this information. And I think that basically it will be also, to a certain extent, this to be probably openly discussed within the supervisory authority with both entities, but I don't know how beneficial it will be to go publicly with this information.
Yeah, can I just clear something, and then I'll let you the floor. The registry will have a public section and a restricted access section. So it's not that anyone can go there and look at anything. There will be a regulation to be issued by the Ministry of Justice in coordination with the Bank of Italy and the Ministry of Finance that will define the actual contents of the restricted action, the restricted section. Sorry. So exactly what document will be accessible and to whom, and. So we are well aware that there are a lot of issues to be considered in this decision to be made on what to make public. For instance, if you are, I was mentioning the fact that investor might have access on the files, but of course, if there is a bank which are selling its portfolio, this access will be, it's very likely that will be given with the consent of the bank. So it's it's not like that everyone can go and have direct access to the information. We are aware that there are some kind, and this is actually we are discussing this. We are aware that there are some kind of information which might be it might be good to kept confidential. For instance, if you're thinking about restructuring plans, there might be information that if they become public, they can spoil the restructuring operation. Let's think about trade secrets or some kind of contracts. Moreover, there are things which have to be kept confidential because of there might be criminal investigation which are under some kind of bankruptcy proceeding. So there are a lot of things which have to be discussed and defined in the details. The message I was trying to convey is that one factor which is negatively affecting the market, at least in Italy, is the lack of information, and we are trying to overcome this obstacle.
But isn't
being
really
aware of all the issues that are behind this.
I'm all for transparency, of course, but I'm biased. But isn't that like really what's also preventing the development of a functional NPL market also in other countries? I mean, because looking, the box is already difficult to open, and that's, the understanding insolvency law in European jurisdictions. And if you at least knew what's in the box, wouldn't it be better for investors, to understand, Rodrigo? Because, this is something that actually exists also in other countries, as we were hearing, yesterday and today as well. There is Pacer in the United States. So at the end of the day, of course, I can see why, but it's an open question. I mean, of course, I can see why if a bank, let's say, has a big position in one single company and that company goes into a distress situation, then everybody can see that, and maybe then all of a sudden the shares of the banks fall. But isn't that also good for the market, that the shares of the bank fall because they made a bad investment? Isn't it good for the shareholder, I mean, for whoever wants to buy the shares of their bank to know that the bank is actually, could be insolvent any day because of that position?
Mario, as I stated with a general caveat, of course I am also in favor of transparency, but I think that basically we should move through a transitioning period, in the sense that basically, and particularly with certain European countries where basically there's a high degree of fragility in the banking sector, certain countries in Europe where there's a high volume of NPLs, what my skepticism is basically that we don't have the tools to restructure, we don't have the transparency, we don't have, in some of these countries, within the judiciary, the celerity which is required to deal with this type of entities and portfolios. So I think that basically, of course, I am in favor of transparency, but I think that basically right now, I don't know whether I will put transparency on the top of my list of priorities. And I think that basically, when you're talking about, for example, in the US, Pacer, I think that basically then, again, we are looking at two different things. One is having access to full transparency of how the process is being conducted. And the other thing is basically, what do we have sitting on the portfolio of an Italian bank or a Greek bank, in the sense that basically with the fragility, with the volatility, and all some kind of the predictions that we have been seeing today and yesterday over dinner, in the sense that basically the projections are not basically so rosy, in the sense that basically we might see some bumps on the road ahead of us. And what worries me is basically this, open all this without a proper framework and with so much fragility. I'm not sure whether it will end up being beneficial. Again, this comes within the general caveat of I am pro-transparency, but basically before, let's say, we pull the Band-Aid, we need to get put the whole system in place and probably move progressively on transparency.
I would like to make a couple of provocative notes. Alan, you mentioned balance sheet, you mentioned books of the banks, but I couldn't find anything in the Basel III rules about liquidity and capital requirements about non-performing loans. And again, I couldn't find anything in the proposal of Basel IV. So how not only to identify, classify loans, but which kind of provision for capital requirements and liquidity requirements under the Basel Committee and for each banks, individual banks, to treat these non-performing loans in the balance sheet, in the book of the banks. And one note for Silvia, we have countries with underdeveloped market on non-performing loans with well-advanced legislation. I would mention Italy, not only for competitive reason, but Italy provided a circular 287 in 2008. Then recently, Bank of Italy, 2013, provided the guidelines how to classify in 4 subcategories non-performing loans, and recently with Law 49 of 2016 and with Institute of Sofferenze, I think created an amazing legislative tool to regulate and also to improve transparency on non-performing loans. On the other side, we have countries with a very well-developed market for non-performing loans and underdeveloped legislation. I have the fortune to collaborate with the Bank of England and also with Rodrigo, non-performing loans, again on the regulatory supervisory perspective. And central banks are very reluctant to disclose information about non-performing loans. We achieved some documents that almost 90% of Chinese banks are full of non-performing loans. For example, in England, Bank of England did not disclose the percentage of non-performing loans. Other central banks, I don't want to mention, I don't want to make names, didn't want to share any information about non-performing loans. So basically, on the one side, we have some countries with underdeveloped market for non-performing loans, but with very well-developed legislation, as Italy, for example, and other countries with well-developed market for non-performing loans, but very poor legislation. This is a matter of transparency. A matter of capital and liquidity requirements, I think there is a need not only for a regulatory framework, but there is need for a proper provision of non-performing loans. Again, I couldn't find anything in the proposal Basel IV, also in Basel III rules about non-performing loans. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Andrea, can I do a follow-up question on the point that you just made about this, how some markets develop and others doesn't? And don't you think that, for example, it's not just a specific legislation, but also, for example, the whole support, like, for example, access to justice, celerity, enforcement of security, sanctity of contracts. I think that basically there are other elements that basically are central to how this contributes to the development of a market for NPLs, irrespective of the, let's say, the technical robustness of the given jurisdiction on that specific issue of NPLs.
I would say expertise, knowledge. I doubt that an Italian judge, an Italian court can understand perfectly how non-performing loans work in reality. And of course, different jurisdiction, of course, different perspective, lengthy process in the continental European countries. I can make as example my country, but yes, celerity, transparency, we can talk about all of these things, but without any regulatory tools, without any regulatory framework, without any insolvency or proper insolvency or pre-insolvency regime, at the moment it's very difficult to talk about how to deal with non-performing loans.
It's not clear to me to what kind of jurisdictions you're referring to. If you are within the
Generally, yeah, within
outside
the EU.
In the EU, there are common rules, very well developed, I should say. Now everything has been standardized. There is a common book of rules. I wouldn't say that what is lacking in Europe is a regulation. Also, from the point of view, we have been overwhelmed by regulation in the banking sector for reasons. So it's not clear to me exactly to what are you. Maybe you are talking about different jurisdictions.
No, I would refer at the EU level, EBA published a sort of regulation that a mixed system of soft law rules, hard law rules. 2013 guidelines on non-performing loans that set up a general definition of non-performing loans. If we can see in details, each jurisdiction, Germany, has no legal definition in the statutory legislation about non-performing loans. France has no legal definition. Bank of Italy provided in 2013 a nice document with a classification of non-performing loans. Before that document, an administrative circular 287 of 2008 introduced for the first time the concept of non-performing loans, and recently in 2016 the statutory legislation on insolvency matters, on non-performing loans. But at the moment, at the EU level, we have a general common definition of non-performing loans that are not repaid on time within 90 days. But there is no legal statutory definition in each jurisdiction, in each banking sector, banking act about non-performing loans. Of course, EBA issued this kind of general common standard, but I would like to see in more details in each country, not only at the EU level, but also outside EU specific provision, how to treat these non-performing loans.
No, that's interesting. Thanks a lot for the... So you basically are saying that what we need is actually more regulation on the NPL side, at least from a definition point of view, in order to move forward into the...
From the regulatory side.
Okay.
Again, I'm not an expert in insolvency, but from the supervision, regulation, there is still lack of clear definition.
Okay. From the... moving back just for a moment to transparency from an investor point of view, because I'm happy that you raised that, Silvia. Obviously I personally think it's actually a very important point in terms of moving forward also on the having a more liquid NPL market. I just would like to have maybe hear from you, Alain, if from your point of view, if more or less transparency does actually impact, because obviously we have different opinions here, and obviously just to see what you, from an investor actually, and the fund side.
Clearly, we welcome the trend, the free trend, which have been described by Silvia in Italy in particular. I think they are key for professional investors to become more active in this market. And I think there is a need to separate two issues. There are issues related to the lack of risk from a financial perspective, in particular for the stock market price and the pricing of a most senior debt instrument of a listed bank. That's obvious. And I think here, the answer is not going to come from the investor. The answer is going to come from the regulator, and the question is, is the provisioning adequate versus the characterization of a loan as performing or non-performing. That's a key first issue. The second issue, and here we clearly need more information, is the ability of an investor to formulate an educated price on an asset. And here we are talking about professional investors. We are not talking, about retail investors. Clearly, no professional investor is going to buy if he doesn't understand the asset or he doesn't have enough information. So from that perspective, there are certainly certain countries where we are behind. It's not a question of regulation per se. It's a question of disclosure to a potential buyer. So as Sylvia was mentioning, it can very well be managed through a restricted due diligence process. But clearly, is the situation satisfactory in all of Europe from that perspective? No. Is this key to the development of this market? Yes. And is it key to attract new investors? Totally yes. And by the way, do NPL need investors? I would think yes.